Hello. I've been given all good to go, so we'll look at getting going. Hello, welcome. I'm Keegan Burrow. I'm lecturer food biochemistry at Lincoln University, and what I'm going to give today is a wee bit of a taster session, cover one of the many topics that I happen to teach about, and this one in particular I'm really passionate about, and sort of show you the scope of some of the opportunities we sort of cover here at Lincoln. So I'll go back to here. As you can see, what I'm going to be talking about, and hopefully by the end of this session, you'll be able to go away and answer, if nothing else, is why does sheep milk make such good cheese? Now, I don't know about you, but I certainly really enjoy cheese. And it's always a fascinating thing to me how something, milk, gets into such a complex and different product such as cheese and what goes into it. And that's hopefully what I'm going to start talking about today. And I will preface this by saying this is only a taster. So if you do, and if you find this interesting and fascinating, you're gonna have to look at investigating further, particularly down into the food science. Oh, turn. Speaker. 1 second, I've got a, oh no, sorry, small technical issue there. Going to look at, food science, and can hopefully see you along at Lincoln and what we cover. So, going a bit more, obviously, what I'll talk about, brief introduction to milk, because milk isn't as simple as what it looks like as a nice clear white, white liquid. Going to talk about sheep and cow milk, and then I'll go into a bit more detail on cheese. And finally, how, answering that question right at the top, why does sheep milk make such good cheese? So, to start with introducing milk, what I like to ask is a very simple question, and I just want you to think about this for a couple of seconds. What is milk? If you can try and picture in your mind, is there one sentence you can have that summarizes what milk is? Just think about that. What do you think milk happens to be? And I'm gonna say what I have in my mind, and we'll see if these line up. In terms of, we've got nutrient liquid there. In terms of what comes to my mind, it's a bit more complicated than just nutrient-rich liquid. It's a wee bit more specific, because there's lots of liquids that are full of nutrients. Soup, liquid full of nutrients. What we say milk is more specifically, it's a biological fluid, so it comes from a living thing, and it's secreted, so it's made and given off from the living thing, is the primary nutrient source of their offspring. So milk is food created by animals to feed their young. And that is the role, nature, and the natural role of what milk is for. It's to feed infants of a wide range of different animals. And then comes a second question. So, what is milk? Well, obviously flowing on from that, what produces milk? And for this one, rather than just thinking of an option, I'm just going to pop this up here. Got 3 examples. Okay, we've got a whale, a camel, and then a fur seal. Out of these animals, and if you want, maybe pop it in the chat, so A, B, and C, out of these animals, which ones produce milk? So I can give people a couple of seconds to think about that and look and popping in the chat. Which ones do you think out of A, whale, B, a camel, and C, a seal, produce milk? I'll give you about a minute or so to think about that. So I'll give you about 15 more seconds. Don't have to write it in the chat if you don't want to. You can just have a think if you want to. So I'll finish up there. So we've got a few different answers. We've got a lot of people who think B. A lot of people think camels produce milk. We've got a couple of people who think A, that whales produce milk. And I think there's 2, maybe 3 people who identified the trick in the question. All of them produce milk. So whales, camels, fur seals, all of these animals produce milk. And particularly, I believe it was Scott in the chat who actually identified it correctly. All of them produce milk because they're mammals. And in fact, not only is it that all of them produce milk because they're mammals, but by definition, all mammals produce milk. It's one of the ways in which we define what a mammal is or isn't. And then we have marsupials, which are a wee bit strange off the end there. I won't get into marsupials today. That's not the topic of my content, but all mammals produce milk. Elephants produce milk, rabbits produce milk, humans produce milk. It's a core defining factor of that. And the reason why I bring this up, and I'll reinforce this later on, is when people talk about milk. If your parents ask you to go to the store and buy some milk, your default thought quite often is cow milk. And that's just one little subset of all of the range of different possible milks that are out there. And why this is interesting but also important is because it shows that there are so many other options and possibilities to be used. And that's what I'm going to focus in on when we get to talking about sheep and cows. But before I do that, I do want to come back to this other little picture I had up earlier, because not only are all mammals produce milk, but one thing we can say is there is some similarities, and I'll talk about the differences in a bit, but there are some similarities in what makes up milk. Milk is really interesting and really has some fascinating complexities. But of core importance is that milk contains, well, mostly water to start with. It's got a fair proportion of fat, and depending on the animal, this will vary. It's got fat, it's got sugar, it's got lactose. So it's got sugars in there, it's got proteins, it's got minerals and vitamins. And these components are present in all milk, but of particular note is that different animals have these components in different amounts. And this is what makes the milks different. And this is why we can have some interesting discussions around the milk of different species. And just to highlight that, I'm gonna move on to talking about sheep milk and cow milk. But just to cover, so milk, biological fluid that normally is used to feed infants. Mammals, all mammals by definition produce milk, and all milks contain the core nutritional components of water, fat, sugar, protein, and then also minerals and vitamins. But moving on from being quite general, and that's just a general introductory portion, let's get into the nitty-gritty. Let's actually start talking about the question that I asked right at the start. Why does sheep milk make such good cheese? And I am going to focus on this comparison between sheep and cow because it makes it quite straightforward, hopefully, for everyone. So to start with, why don't we look at what cow's milk looks like? So cow's milk, one second, I'm just moving the window across so I can see this a bit better. Yeah. Cow's milk is made up of, and we generalize these components. We say solids is anything, it's a sum total of components. But if we ignore the water, because water is most of milk, we have fat, protein, and vitamins and minerals. Now, why don't we compare those numbers to sheep milk? Okay, so we've got cow milk staying in yellow and sheep milk in light blue. Well, sheep milk happens to have higher levels of fat. Keep this in mind. Sheep milk contains higher levels of fat compared to cow's milk. Sheep milk has got higher levels of protein compared to cow's milk. We've got more fat and more protein. But finally, also, sheep milk has got higher levels of vitamins and minerals. So this is another core component that sheep milk's got higher amounts of compared to cow's milk. So why this is of interest and importance and why I'm highlighting it is really what it indicates is that sheep milk and cow milk are just compositionally quite different. They are not consistent in terms of the amount of fat or protein or vitamins or minerals. Now, if you're thinking of this from the perspective of just drinking the milk, it's probably particularly quite a good thing. It's more protein in it. It's going to have more fat if you're aiming for maybe a diet that's got higher fat, more vitamins and minerals, which is also potentially beneficial. Now, what I also like to remember, and this is just some components of this. It's basically to summarize these last few slides. The sheep's not a cow, and that different animals of these different species produce milk with different components. Sheep, in particular, happen to produce milk with higher levels of core nutritional components than cow's milk. And I want you to, again, keep this in mind. Now, so what have I covered? I've talked generally about milk, more specifically, sheep milk versus cow's milk. The thing that I haven't quite talked about yet, probably should get onto that, is the other part of the main question. Cheese. Why does sheep milk make such great cheese? That's what I'm talking about here today. Well, first of all, just like milk, I do want to ask a question. What is cheese? Now, if anyone wants to try and summarize cheeses in one sentence in the chat, feel free to. But I'll say right now, it's not an easy thing to define. It's not quite a simple food product to think about. Lots of different types of cheese from lots of different parts of the world. We've got a couple of people saying they can explain it by speaking. Exactly. There's two definitions I'm going to highlight here. And then I'll get onto it a bit more. So some people like to say that cheese is milk that's just gone off. And my favorite quote, which is milk gone off big time styling. It's really gone off in quite a impressive way, but it's not a great way to define it, I don't think. It doesn't sound very pleasing if you describe cheese as milk that's gone off in quite a spectacular fashion. Strictly speaking, and if we go to a dictionary, people say that it is a food made from the pressed curds of milk. Now, again, there's a bit of a problem there. What are we talking about when we're talking about the curds of milk? How do we get milk from a liquid product into a solid product? Well, to understand that process, to understand how we get liquid milk, solid cheese, it's a lot of different components we've got to consider. And I'm going to walk through a couple of these to help you understand this process. But again, it's just a bit of a taster. And what I'm covering here is skimming the surface of this complexity. So if we look at milk, this is a good example. We just look at it. It's a clear, well, not clear, it's a white liquid or opaque liquid. But milk isn't that simple in terms of its structure. It's got a lot more going on for it under the surface. If we magnify down, say we look at it at 100 times magnification, instead of just seeing a white liquid, we see that it's white liquid, got little dots of fat in it. Okay, so milk's got water, and in there, tiny little dots of fat and a wee bit of protein. But that's not even the secret to cheese. That's not what we have to consider. this is the next part. If we look at milk at 10,000 times magnification, what we see is these big drops of fat and these tiny little things we call the casein micelle. And the reason why I've got this diagram here is because really hard to get nice images at 10,000 times magnification. So we've got a simplified diagram here. But what these casein micelles are, and are really important and unique, are little tiny balls of protein, a wee bit of calcium in there as well, floating around in the milk. They're so small, just kind of like dust particles in the air. They just sit in the milk and suspend. And what they look like, it's kind of like a little ball with furry hairs on the end. So almost, if you think of a tennis ball that needs a shave. Little balls with lots of little hairs on the end. Now, this is really important because these little balls that we see at the 10,000 times magnification, this is what we turn and we use to make cheese. So when we make cheese, and we can make cheese in a number of ways, the most common is using an enzyme called rennet. We take milk, we turn it to cheese by shaving off all the little hairs and all the little balls of casein stick together. They stick together, they start to form a solid, and that is how we end up getting our cheese. I'll go back to here. And in fact, the casein is what we refer to as the curds of milk. So if we think about what makes cheese, what is cheese? It's a food made from the pressed curds of milk. It's food made of all the little microscopic particles inside milk stick together, and then we press out the water so we get our nice firm cheeses, and we get rid of all of the excess water that is present in our glass of milk. And just for context, when we are making cheese, we land up with a large amount of excess water that lands up being referred to as curds. And so, in the whey, got the wording wrong, lands up being referred to as whey. And so in the process of cheese making, we do have a lot of excess material that often lands up being used for other reasons. And the use of whey, or the leftover material from cheese making, again, not going to go into here, but even that is a really interesting area of work, of how to use waste material during the production of food. So, talked about what milk is, talked about the difference between cow and sheep, talked about how we get from liquid milk to cheese. So then comes the final step, the final aspect, and me actually addressing the question of the topic, I know, nearly halfway through. And that is, what is the actual effect of milk type on cheese? how do we land up with different types of cheese developed from different types of milk? And just like any thing, and you'll notice I have a tendency, think about questions. Well, first thing we have to think about when we think about how does milk cheese is what makes good cheese. And personally, and I don't know about you all, the first thing I like to think about when I think about cheese is the flavor. I like cheese that tastes good. I don't know about you, but one of the core things around choosing food is what just tastes good. And so we then have to think, okay, we've got these differences in milk composition. How do they affect the final taste of the cheese itself? And to start with, if you think back, and I said sheep milk has got more protein and more fats or more lipids in it than cow's milk. Well, by far, the most important component for the development of flavor in cheese is protein and fat. And fat in particular plays a really key role. I like to think about it simply as fat means flavor. Now, when you're cooking at home, this may be as simple as adding oil or adding butter or deep frying something to make it taste really good. But when it comes to cheese, it's not just the fact that we've got lots and lots of fat in there that makes it taste good. But particularly in cheeses when they're stored, but through the process of cheese making, we end up with a lot of reactions occurring that break down the fats within the milk and that are trapped within the matrix. And we have a lot of chemical reactions occurring to those fats. We land up with the breakdown of fats into various acids, alcohols, esters that then go on to form flavor compounds that actually contribute to cheese tasting and smelling the way it is. So a really good example of this is Parmesan cheese. So Parmesan cheese, and particularly real Parmesan cheese, has got a really distinctive smell. Some people love it. Some people cannot stand it. It's sort of acidic and got a wee bit of almost like a putrid smell to it, some may say. Now, some people like it, some people hate it. But that particularly sharp smell associated with Parmesan cheese, for those of you who know that smell, directly comes from the breakdown of fats in milk. Now, what sheep milk provides, and hopefully you see where this is going, is a lot more fat for these sorts of reactions to occur. By just having more of fat to be able to form these reactions, we can get more flavor formation occurring when we're making our cheese. What is of particular note in this context is that in some cases, we don't necessarily want too much, for example, of that fatty, maybe that Parmesan-like aroma and flavor developing. But that's fine, first of all, because we can get rid of fat in milk quite well and quite efficiently. But secondarily, the fact that this isn't the only way in which we get flavor developing. So people like to gravitate towards fat. But there's another aspect that I'll draw attention to, and this is the role that protein plays in the development of flavor within cheese. Because fat, lots of flavor. But I don't know about you, but personally, I don't just want to sit and drink a litre of oil. It's not going to be pleasant. Do some reactions to it, but it's not going to taste great and it's going to have a bit of a strange flavor to it. But protein also plays a really key role in the flavor that occurs. In particular, during cheese making, we get the breakdown of protein. So we get the breakdown of fat, and I'm going to scroll back. I even said one of the core ways in which we get from liquid to solid is by breaking down proteins. During that breakdown of protein, we again end up with a lot of really interesting chemical reactions occurring. We get various oxidation and reduction reactions. We get some complex interactions, sometimes between fats and proteins. And we get some other interesting reactions that I'll touch on in a second. But what this does is this gives us a whole nother suite of flavor compounds and flavors that can be produced within cheese. Of particular note, when we think about sheep's milk, and why does sheep's milk, not just because it's got more protein, have the potential to have more flavor development in it, is the nature of some of the proteins within sheep's milk more easily reacted into what we refer to as sulfur-containing compounds. So proteins in sheep milk can have higher levels of sulfur-containing compounds, which can have some really unique flavors associated with them. The other one of note is the production of acids. And I don't know if anyone of you has had much interaction with raw wool, unprocessed wool. Unprocessed wool has a really sort of oily texture to it, and it's got a really unique smell. It's not the nicest on its own, again, but the compounds that help produce that smell, which are particularly known as linalool and linoleic acid, can also be derived in the breakdown of proteins. And in cheese, at low levels, those components can give a really rich, creamy flavor that is considered quite desirable. So what have I covered? Well, we're saying that the breakdown of fats, the breakdown of proteins produces the flavor in cheese. And first of all, because we've got more fat, more protein, we'll end up with a more flavorful product in sheep's milk. Cheeses and sheep's milk produced cheeses. Secondly, there are a couple of unique characteristics, particularly high levels of sulfur compounds that can result in unique flavors developing. But there is one other characteristic that I'll touch on very briefly. And that is the fact that I recognize not everyone, first of all, likes all cheeses, particularly blue cheese. I know some people love blue cheese. Some people can't stand it. There are some people who are allergic to it. But the other unique thing that sheep milk has, which provides particular opportunities in the context of cheese production, is that it has the potential to provide specific microorganisms for the production of blue cheeses. So Roquefort, pronouncing it wrong, it's French and my New Zealand accent does not translate to French very well, is a French style blue cheese which specifically has to contain sheep's milk to allow for the growth of bacteria that help in the development of the flavor. So you can talk about cheese type, talk about the internal milk type and the internal components of the milk helping to develop the flavor and the texture of cheeses, but also they can act as a substrate for specific microorganisms that can then help ferment and help produce and break down those components to make flavor compounds. In particular, sheep's milk is quite widely associated with some blue cheeses or very strong fermented well-aged cheese. And just for context, Roquefort, if it's produced traditionally in France, can take a couple of years for its fermentation and maturing process. So it's not quick. Flavor doesn't develop overnight. It's not just because it's got more protein or fat, but because characteristics which can allow for the bacteria and the fungus, particularly penicillin fungus, to grow within it as well. Of course, if you don't like blue cheese, it doesn't matter. You're never going to like it at all. So recognize that it can be very much an acquired taste. So, recognizing, I think I've, as always, talked slightly faster than I normally would, but I'm going to give a chance for any questions in a second. What have I sort of covered here? Well, first of all, introducing milk, covering sheep milk, comparison to cow's milk, how cheese making process occurs and what core aspects of milk considered when we're making cheese, and then really linking that in to why does sheep milk make such good cheese, which in this case, at least in my opinion, is because it makes cheese with such good flavor, and that flavor comes from the protein, the fat, and its ability to host microorganisms. So that's content that I'm going to cover, and I'm going to give a chance for questions in a second. But what I will say is, really, this is just a taster. So if you want to know more, certainly going to have to look at investigating in terms of Lincoln as an option, and I'm more than happy to talk far more about cheese and maybe have a literal taster with you, if any of you, if I do get to see you. So on that note, there's some questions here that have come through. So I will cover questions that are coming up briefly. So the first one is asking about soy milk or coconut milk. Can we call them milk? They still have similar ingredients, but aren't produced by mammals. Technically, they are not milk. So though marketers and people selling them like to call soy milk, coconut milk. You may have heard of oat milk, hemp milk. There's a lot out there. They're not milk. They don't even have similar ingredients naturally, and they're produced and they're put together in a lab. So lots of food scientists like myself have sat down in a lab and systematically tried to turn a soybean into a liquid product. More correctly, what they're called are milk-like beverages or milk-like substitutes. And there is a big discussion and a big lot of research at the moment about whether they are actually even good for you or equivalent to milk at the moment. So what I'll say is the marketers have one and called them milk, but they aren't really milk products. They're made to resemble milk and mimic it, just like if you think about maybe a trying to think of a good example here, say a fake banana flavor. Doesn't quite taste like banana, but it almost does. Kind of like doing that, but with milk. Hopefully that covers your question there. My simple answer is they're not milk. They shouldn't be called milk. The second question I've got is about sensory evaluation for foods. Now, this is a really interesting one that personally I'm actually not an expert on, and I will admit this now. I have a couple of colleagues who I work with whose entire speciality is sensory evaluation. So for sensory evaluation, there's a lot of time and effort put into trying to measure and evaluate people's responses and differentiating between if someone likes the liking of a product versus trying to quantify a product. And particularly often we're doing this in controlled environments and we're using rating scales. And if you would have known, I said about, for example, blue cheese, not everyone likes blue cheese. So we often either ask about if people like their opinions of products or talking about their actual trying to quantify how bitter is this, how sweet is this salty. In terms of often how that process works, and as I said, I'm not an expert on that, we do a lot of work with things such as randomization, blinding food products, so you're not telling people what they're consuming, or psychological tricks. So that's what I'm going to mention about that, is that, first of all, if you are interested in that, it's a whole area and courses and experts just in food science who just focus on sensory evaluation. It's a really interesting area I do find fascinating. A lot of it is trying to differentiate between people liking things and the true characteristics of those products. So hopefully that covers some of your question there. Got a second question here, another question. What causes bitterness in cheese? I can cover this one. I'm actually going to go back to here. So I talked about, so what causes bitterness in cheese? So you noticed I said we have breakdown of protein. We get lots of flavor compounds occurring. Well, this same reaction, which can produce different components, the flavor, so maybe the smell of the product will also produce bitterness at the same time. So the breakdown of protein produces bitterness as well. So we get sort of both good aspects and some bad aspects there. So hopefully that covers that aspect there. So, is it possible to produce plant-based cheeses for people who can't take dairy products? Simple answer, yes, but I personally wouldn't call them cheeses. So there are, and certainly I know in New Zealand, and I would actually expect that getting more and more common internationally, plant-based products that are particularly either vegan or vegetarian that have similar characteristics as cheese. So I know that you can get, for example, soy-based Parmesan cheeses and also soft cheeses. There is, and the processing is similar to the production of tofu, but got a slight difference, but it is very much possible. Some of the issues are the same issues we have with producing plant-based milks, so making them nutritionally similar, achieving similar taste or flavor, and also having different shelf lives and nutritional contents, but very possible and already produced. And you can almost think to an extent tofu is sort of an old-fashioned version of that, but there are other versions as well. So there's another question here from Scott, I believe, which is thoughts about artificial milk. Yes, it does exist. I do agree. There are some fascinating work on producing milk from animals. For those of you who aren't aware, not from animals, not from plants, but basically in the lab that has exactly the same composition as the plant or as the animal-based milk. At the moment, my thoughts is it's still very much in a research proof of concept phase, and the process is so expensive that it's very hard for that to become commercial. You won't see it in a supermarket. You may see it online or in a news article. I think that rather than plant-based milks is probably the future of some dairy consumption. So we're still going to have animals, we're still going to have farms, but artificial milk will over time become a really interesting area, and it's growing in popularity, though it is very expensive. It's very lab-based at the moment. So really good thing to think about there. Got another question. Do we have to focus on growth of children? Height, weight, intelligence? Yes. So today, I have talked about sheep milk making good cheese. This isn't the only thing we can use sheep milk or non-bovine milk for, and particularly sheep milk and goat milk being used as infant formula or replacement for human milk. It's actually an area that my other area of interest in speciality. So here I'm talking about the use of milk for adults. We talk about the use of milk for children. We think about other things, and you're very right. Height, weight, growth, we've got allergies. And though the use of breast milk or human milk is considered the best option for the development of infants and young children. Milk from other species can play a role in cases where that isn't possible. And there's lots of reasons before that, or in later stages of growth. So instead of talking about kids from 0 to 1 or 2 years, we're talking 2 or 3 years on. And non-bovine milk, so sheep milk, goat milk, all really promising options to help the growth of children. And I would actually suggest, and this links to one of the questions up here, go and have a look, if you do, some soy milk or coconut milk in your cupboard at home, probably will say not suitable as a food for infants. And that's because we have to think about the growth of children, and those things aren't the best option for the growth of children. And we have specialist formulas that we use for that. So there's another question here. Progress of turning milk into cheese caused the unpleasant odor of blue cheese. That's not so yes and no. It's not the process of turning milk directly to cheese immediately that causes the formation of the odor. It's the long-term fermentation with bacteria breaking down protein and breaking down the fats. So not immediately, but over the long term, we can get the development of that very distinctive blue cheese smell. And some people do find it unpleasant, and some people love it. So personally, don't really like the smell, but I do like how it tastes. But that's from long-term storage there. So hopefully that answers your question. Got another one. The holes in cheese come from. That links to the answer before. So some cheeses, as they're stored and as, again, in this case, it's different bacteria and different yeast are used to ferment cheese over time. Those bacteria produce gas that expand and produce bubbles in it. So we have holes, particularly Swiss cheese is the classic one. I think Emmenthal, my pronunciation's terrible, also has that. And that's similar to how the smell in blue cheese is made from bacteria. The holes in other cheese are also made from bacteria and fungi. Got another one here. Would goat milk have similar advantage as sheep milk? Yes and no. So I said that sheep are not cows. Sheep milk are different. Sheep milk is different than cow milk. Goat milk is sort of in between, and I can actually do this here. Like to think, if you look at the diagram I have that has fat, got cow milk down here, sheep milk all the way up there. Goat milk sits for all of these. About halfway in between. So it has slightly more protein and slightly more fat than cow's milk, but not as much as sheep. So again, goat's milk is also another milk that's often used for cheese making because of similar characteristics as well. So yes, similar advantages to sheep's milk, but not quite as much. Got another question here. Cows genetically modified, which are leading to changes in dairy products, is harmful to humans. So, there's a lot to unpack in this question. So, the question is, I heard that cows are genetically modified, which leads to changes in the quality of dairy products, and that's harmful to humans. First of all, for the most part, and in New Zealand and Europe, cows are not genetically modified. And in fact, in a lot of countries, it's illegal to have any genetically modified food products. So certainly in New Zealand and in Europe, there is no genetic modification occurring in food. There is a lot of breeding. And there's lots and years, and there's been centuries, millennia, hundreds and thousands of years of breeding of animals to produce all of the species we have. So there's a lot of breeding and genetic changes, but not genetic modification. Now, whether those changes that humans have made are harmful to humans or not is, I think, a wee bit more of a complex question. And that's because of two things. First of all, it doesn't matter what food product you talk about, too much of any food is bad for you. Full stop. If you only drunk milk, that would be bad for you. If you only eat soybeans, that would be bad for you. If you only consumed potatoes, that would be bad for you. Too much of any food is bad for you. And so too much of milk is bad for you. In moderation, though, dairy products are really important for most people. There is just some people who have various allergies to dairy products. So you may have lactose intolerance or have a protein allergy, just like some people have a peanut allergy. And therefore you shouldn't eat dairy products. But for the majority of people, if they consume dairy products in moderation, they are not bad for you. If you eat too much or if you have specific allergy, that is harmful. What's changed recently is that people are eating a lot more dairy products at times when they wouldn't have previously, and that's the harm there. So not genetically modified, at least in most of the world, though there are some countries which have exceptions. But as long as you're eating it in moderation, unless you've got a specific allergy, it should be fine. Oh, so I've got another, cow's milk cause of early sexual development in girls. No. So the question is, did cow's milk cause early sexual development in girls? What do I think about this? The answer is no. And the same has also been said about soy milk causing changes in sexual development or other food products causing harms of that. There is evidence to show that a better quality diet, regardless of what you consume, may result in earlier sexual development. So just having a higher level of a better quality diet can result in early sexual development. It results in people growing taller as well. results in people having better teeth. It results in people living longer because they have better nutrition. It's not specifically linked to any single part of your diet or any single thing you are eating. It is more wide about eating a better quality diet than people did 50 years ago, 20 years ago, 50 years ago, 200 years ago. And what I would say is, and it's really interesting, and I've done this, I've talked to my grandparents about the foods they grew up on. And the food my grandparents grew up on was not that great. There was a lot of boiled vegetables and bland potatoes and not very much tasty things, interesting things, a lot less fruits and vegetables and dairy products. And it's that overall difference that's important, is people are eating better now in almost every part of the world than we ever have before. Growing faster, growing bigger, stronger, and living longer as well. So not specifically dairy products, but we've got a better diet, and that results in a lot of things, including early sexual development, but also growing more, living longer as well. So, any other questions? No? So I think that sounds like the end of it there. So hopefully you all found that interesting. There's a lot when it comes to food. And I'm going to say this is probably my take home message, other than what sheep milk does to make such good cheese, is that there is so much when it comes to food. And you're thinking, now what I've covered here, an entire topic in terms of food science, nutritional science, or any sort of animal sciences. Can learn so much more about it. And certainly here at Lincoln, this is our speciality. So I'll give sort of a final chance for any last minute questions. So I'll look at finishing there. Thank you all very much. And hopefully you found this interesting. You've learned a lot out of the experience today. And go and eat some cheese. Thank you.